2 hours ago, the futures market printed a number that the White House had privately told senior energy advisors was impossible. Not unlikely, not worst case. Impossible. Brent crude crossed $127 a barrel in after-hours trading and is still moving. The options desk at Goldman Sachs activated a contingency model that had been built 18 months ago and labeled internally the scenario nobody wants to use. The label on that model is $140, and the trigger that activated it was not a supply disruption, it was not a pipeline failure, it was not a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. It was a presidential decision made in Washington that the people who made it did not fully model before they made it. The strikes on Iranian nuclear infrastructure were sold to the American public as a precision operation with defined objectives and manageable consequences. The definition of manageable, it is now becoming clear, did not include a serious analysis of what happens to the price of everything Americans buy, heat their homes with, and drive their cars on when the Persian Gulf threat architecture shifts overnight from theoretical to operational. That analysis was available, it was prepared, it was delivered to the relevant decision makers weeks before the first munition was released. And the decision was made anyway. That gap between what the model showed and what the decision makers chose is the strategic error at the center of this story. And American consumers are about to pay for it at a level that will define the political and economic landscape of this country for the next 2 years. To understand why $140 oil is not a worst-case projection but an increasingly central scenario, you need to understand the specific geography of American energy vulnerability and why the Iran strikes activated pressure points that no amount of strategic reserve release can address at the speed the situation requires. First, the Strait of Hormuz. Approximately 21 million barrels of oil pass through this 21-mile-wide choke point every single day. That represents roughly 21% of total global petroleum liquids consumption. Iran has threatened Hormuz closure repeatedly over the past decade, and those threats have historically been discounted by markets because the cost to Iran of closing its own primary export route was considered prohibitive. That calculus has now changed in a specific and important way. An Iran whose nuclear infrastructure has been struck, whose regional influence architecture is under pressure, and whose leadership faces internal political dynamics that require demonstrating consequences has a different cost-benefit calculation on Hormuz than the Iran that existed 3 weeks ago. The threat has not become certain, but it has become real in a way that markets are pricing with urgency they have not shown before. Second, the insurance and shipping dimension that almost no mainstream coverage is addressing. Even without a physical Hormuz closure, the strike on Iran has already triggered emergency reviews at Lloyd's of London and every major maritime insurer that covers Gulf shipping. War risk premiums on tankers transiting the Persian Gulf have increased by a factor that is repricing every barrel of oil that moves through that corridor before it reaches a single refinery anywhere in the world. Shipping companies are quietly rerouting where alternatives exist. Where they do not exist, they are passing the cost increase directly into the price of crude. This mechanism operates independently of any Iranian military action. It is happening right now, driven entirely by the probability shift that the strikes created, and it alone accounts for a meaningful portion of the price movement already visible in futures markets. Third, and this is the strategic error that the White House energy team will be explaining to congressional committees for months, the American Strategic Petroleum Reserve is not the instrument that the administration's public statements have implied it is. The SPR holds approximately 350 million barrels. American consumption runs at roughly 20 million barrels per day. A full SPR release covers 17 days of consumption. It does not cover a sustained Gulf disruption. It does not cover the insurance and logistics repricing already underway. And it does not address the specific refinery configuration problem that is the most underreported dimension of this entire situation. But this is where the strategic miscalculation becomes genuinely difficult to explain away. American Gulf Coast refineries are not interchangeable instruments that can process any grade of oil with equal efficiency. They are capital-intensive, highly specialized facilities that were configured over decades specifically to process the grades of crude that flow from particular regions. Many of the largest Gulf Coast refinery complexes were configured specifically to process heavy sour crude from certain Gulf producers and, critically, from the Canadian oil sands. Disrupting the supply chain architecture of the Persian Gulf does not simply reduce the volume of oil available. It creates a grade mismatch problem that takes months, not days, to resolve even with unlimited money and political will. The White House energy advisors who prepared the pre-strike assessment flagged this. The flag did not change the outcome of the decision. The American consumer is the end point of every one of these mechanisms, and the timeline between a geopolitical decision made in Washington and the moment that decision appears on a gas station price board is shorter than most political planning horizons account for. Gasoline prices in the United States are already responding. Futures pricing for unleaded gasoline implies retail prices that, in the highest-cost states, will cross levels not seen since the post-COVID supply shock of 2022. But the 2022 comparison understates what is coming if the Gulf situation develops along the trajectory that current market pricing implies. The 2022 price shock was driven by a demand-supply imbalance that was always going to self-correct as supply chains normalized. What is being priced now is a structural threat to supply architecture that does not self-correct when consumer demand adjusts. If Hormuz becomes operationally threatened, the price signal is not a spike that normalizes. It is a plateau at levels that have no recent historical precedent in the American consumer experience. The downstream effects extend well beyond gasoline. Jet fuel prices determine airfare. Diesel prices determine the cost of every truck that moves every product sold in every store in America. Heating oil prices determine what American households in the Northeast pay to stay warm next winter. Petrochemical feedstock prices determine the cost of plastics, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, and synthetic materials that flow through virtually every manufacturing supply chain in the country. When oil moves from $80 to $140, it does not raise one price. It raises every price simultaneously through supply chains so deeply embedded in the structure of the American economy that the full inflationary effect takes 6 to 12 months to fully manifest, arriving in waves rather than all at once, making it impossible for any administration to declare the problem resolved. Consider what that wave looks like for an ordinary American household. The family filling a tank pays more immediately. The same family buying groceries the following week pays more because the trucks that restocked those shelves ran on diesel that just got more expensive. The utility bill that arrives the month after reflects heating fuel costs that moved with the oil price. Each wave arrives slightly after the last, creating escalating pressure that compounds month over month with no clear endpoint. That is the lived experience of $140 oil. And it is the experience that no White House communications strategy has ever successfully managed once fully underway. What happened inside the Federal Reserve's Analysis Division when the futures market printed $127 is not something that will be publicly disclosed, but the implications are not difficult to model. The Fed has spent 2 years bringing inflation from post-COVID peaks toward its 2% target. An oil shock of the magnitude currently being priced would not simply slow that progress. It would reverse it, potentially by several percentage points, at a moment when the interest rate environment has limited room to absorb a second inflationary shock without triggering the recession dynamics that rate increases at this stage of the cycle would produce. The Fed would face a choice between allowing inflation to re-accelerate or raising rates into an economy already showing signs of demand fatigue. Neither option produces a good outcome for American households. The American business community registered its alarm with unusual speed and directness. The American Petroleum Institute issued a statement noting that the current price trajectory, if sustained, would damage American industrial competitiveness at a moment of significant supply chain restructuring. The National Association of Manufacturers warned that energy cost increases of this magnitude affect the viability of domestic production in sectors the administration has publicly committed to rebuilding. Airlines, trucking companies, and chemical manufacturers began filing operational guidance revisions that reflect energy cost assumptions materially higher than their planning baselines from 60 days ago. These are not political actors making political statements. These are finance departments updating spreadsheets with numbers the market is providing. The political dimension of $140 oil operates on a timeline that the administration understands very clearly. Gasoline prices are the most viscerally experienced economic indicator in American political life. They are posted in large numbers on signs visible from every major road in every congressional district in the country. They are discussed at kitchen tables in swing states with a directness and frequency that no other economic data point matches. The historical correlation between gasoline prices and presidential approval ratings is one of the most robust relationships in American political science. Every point that oil moves toward $140 is a data point that opposition political strategists are watching with the specific attention of people who understand exactly what it means for the next election cycle. The geography of that political damage is not evenly distributed, and the distribution matters. The states where gasoline price sensitivity is highest, where residents drive longer distances and household budgets carry less cushion, overlap with remarkable precision with the states whose electoral votes are most contested. A $140 oil environment sustained for 6 months damages the administration's political position most severely in exactly the places where the margin between winning and losing is measured in thousands of votes. The political strategists inside the White House are running those models right now. The numbers they are looking at are not comfortable. The White House is not without options. Emergency coordination with Gulf producers to increase output is possible, though the timeline for that output to reach American refineries is measured in weeks, not days, and the willingness of Gulf producers to absorb the political cost of being seen to rescue Washington from the consequences of its own decision is not guaranteed. Accelerated permitting for domestic production is available as a signal, though the production response to permitting decisions takes months to years to manifest in actual barrels. Targeted releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve can blunt short-term price spikes but cannot address the structural supply architecture disruption that the insurance and shipping repricing represents. None of these options undo the fundamental problem. The strikes created a threat environment in the Persian Gulf that repriced risk for every barrel of oil that moves through it. That repricing is not a temporary market reaction to be waited out. It is a structural adjustment to a new threat landscape that will persist for as long as the threat landscape persists, and the threat landscape will persist for as long as the underlying conflict remains unresolved, which, based on the 3 endgame scenarios currently circulating in State Department planning documents, could be measured in years rather than months. 2 hours ago, the futures market printed a number the White House called impossible. 2 hours later, every American who drives to work, heats their home, or buys groceries that arrived on a truck is living inside the consequence of a decision that was made without fully accounting for what they would pay for it. The strikes were presented as a national security decision. They are becoming an economic one, and the American consumer, who was not consulted, was not warned, and was not part of the calculation, is the one holding the bill. Washington made a strategic bet. The price board at your nearest gas station is keeping score.